Welcome.
This is the Two Cities.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Hi everyone, it's Nikki with Tales of Two Cities podcast, and I am sitting here with Kirk, my dear friend and fellow folklorist, and he is going to tell us about Krampus.
Krampus, yes. Okay, so Krampus, I think is getting a lot of, some press in the U.S., right? So probably a lot of people this year anyway have kind of at least peripherally heard of this Krampus and what it is. Or seen your teaser and seen a picture of Krampus selling pizza in Eugene.
Everyone guessed Krampus when I put this.
Yeah, people knew, right?
It's Krampus!
Yeah, and that the image from the hey, here's a clue, is actually from a 2013, I think, novel by Brom, who's he's a fantasy artist, but also a novelist.
I knew you would know it.
Yeah, right? And that's actually, he illustrated as well. It's like he wrote the novel and illustrated it. But that's actually an early kind of like big mass culture moment for Krampus in the United States. And the picture you chose is his interpretation of a Bellschnickel.
Someone's commented that!
Yes, okay, so they know what's up, right? Which is like, it's kind of another one of these variations of like Krampus and in general how Krampus works. And Bellschnickel actually has a presence, an early American presence that very much predates like the whole Krampus thing in the U.S. as it's playing out now.
So what is Krampus?
So Krampus is traditional. It's an Austrian tradition, Alpen Austria, and also other areas of the Alps too. So primarily in Austria, but they do it in parts of Italy, and then bleeds over into southern Germany a little bit. But it's prominently from Austrian Alps, those regions. And so, kind of, there's a couple of things going on with Krampus. Krampus Nacht, right, is actually St. Nicholas's Eve, right? So Krampus is this, is usually embodied, right? So people are wearing this costume that has all these kind of animal hides, sheep's hides, ibex horns, sometimes two, sometimes many. These carved masks called larvae, right? Like impossible teeth, snarling faces, huge cattle bells. So when they like move through the villages, it just creates this kind of clatter. But essentially they follow St. Nicholas as they kind of, they go through the towns, but it's not like a parade, right? Like they go through these villages and it's kind of just going from house to house where families with children are. And they visit the houses, these house visits, and these are less common now, but they're traditional and they still play out traditionally in some villages in the Alps. And what happens essentially is St. Nicholas comes in, he does his spiel first, right? So he's this ecclesiastical figure. And when we say St. Nicholas in this context, it's not, ho, 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 Santa Claus, right? Like it's not the jolly old elf.
Jolly old St. Nick.
Yeah, it's not him. It's essentially a guy dressed as a bishop, right? But we know from the context and from the fact that it's associated with the St. Nicholas feast day that he's representing St. Nicholas.
It doesn't
right?
sound like a jolly Santa.
No, it's not. But he comes in and he's for the children, like he's recognizable as a good guy, right? But he asks things of them, right? Like performances, psalms or songs, and then they have to essentially do that, perform appropriately for the saint, and he gives them some kind of small gift, okay? After that, he moves aside and calls in the Krampus, right? So this big, scary, shaggy beast comes in. The family's around the table, so the Krampus will come in from the other side of the table, and the table acts as a kind of barrier. But he comes in and he will threaten the kids, essentially, with switches or kind of like these horsehair whips. And tell them if they don't continue to, be on the right path. And sometimes, the parents and the families are in on this, right? Mm-hmm. So the performers, these guys who are dressed up and performing, might be like, they might get a little hint, that the, little Johnny wasn't, on his best behavior last year.
He didn't make his bed.
Right, exactly. But so then they'll come in and there's this kind of moment of tension, but it's pretty playful. at least from the videos that like you can find on YouTube, of these being contemporarily enacted. But the threat is, right, like if you don't stay on the right path, next year I'm going to carry you away, right? And then there's the kind of the implicit threat of cannibalism, or I don't know, being tossed into the wilderness, right, into the cold river or something like that. So that's kind of the traditional enactment. It depends on these house visits, right? So that's how you get the relationship kind of performed in a real clear way, right? About how Saint Nicholas like relates to Krampus and vice versa. And Saint Nicholas is not like in opposition to Krampus, right? Like he lets the guy in, right? Krampus is kind of an agent of Saint Nicholas in this traditional sense. So
they're business partners.
They're absolutely business partners. Or like sometimes, like when you watch some of these videos, to my mind, it's like having a dog on a chain almost, right? You know what I mean? Like it's like, okay, we did this thing, and it's like, now go, grr, so he steps aside and lets his enforcer in, I guess, in a way, is how it seems.
Like,
yeah, but it's interesting. So you have this house visit, but there's also the processional bit, which is a little more chaotic. And so I guess I should backtrack a little bit and kind of talk about what the whole system looks like in Austria. So you have what are called Krampus troops, sometimes referred to as passes, right? And so these are regional groups of men who kind of, they stay connected year round, right? It's almost like a club in a way. But there can be more than 10 of them, right? So you have multiple Krampuses as part of a troop, and then a single Saint Nicholas. Yeah. And he'll lead them, and they like go through the town just clanging and whipping and stuff. Yeah, it's a pack of them.
Like a dog.
Yeah, like wolves almost, right?
Like
like
wolves.
And they're following him through town. It's very interesting to me that you have this, this performed procession, right, where people are masking and costuming, but you have to have a single Saint Nicholas, right? Like you can't have more than one. There's no SantaCon vibe here, right? Like it just has to be Saint Nicholas. But you have, you can have 10 or more of these like, big beasts, right? Like coming through and making all this noise. With different kind of numbers of horns and different carved, scary faces, right? So it is kind of a pack of animals almost. But they're all hairy. They all have it's dark. All sheeps. Yeah, it's dark, it's brown, it's depending. Like often these, the suits will be individualized in a way, right? Like particularly with the carved masks.
But there's no abominable white Krampus?
No, I mean, maybe there is. I mean, I am thinking maybe lighter grays and stuff like that.
But traditionally they're darker.
Yeah, traditionally they're darker colors. Browns and darker grays and things like that. So you have this one Saint Nick, all these Krampuses, and then you'll have angels. So women, like family members, friends, will dress all in white and kind of, will walk, and they kind of walk on either side of St. Nicholas, and is, kind of almost this idea, as Al Reinauer put it, who's, wrote the book, Krampus and the Old Dark Christmas, right, which was in 2016, and still the book, right, in the U.S. on this kind of tradition. So there's almost this common female presence, right, in case the kids really freak out when Krampus comes along. And then one more guy who is the basket carrier. And so he's more, in central and northern Germany, this kind of figure is more human, known as Knecht Ruprecht, right? And he's just this kind of wild man, right? Like big beard, kind of dirty, comes out of the woods, and that's kind of what this basket carrier looks like. So you have this whole cast of characters that play into the procession and the house visit performances in Austria. So that's the traditional kind of, that's where the figure emerges from, that we kind of are interacting with as Krampus in the U.S. today.
Where does it come from?
Where does it come from? That's a good question. I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but popular conceptions and often, the people who are, from my research, the people in Austria who are performing this kind of stuff do see the Krampus as this pre-Christian figure, right? Like there's some kind of like pagan embodiment of like wild winter and the wilderness in general, darkness, right? And then syncretized with the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Catholic Church kind of lets the figure come along, but the assumption is, and it's a pretty, I think it's a pretty solid assumption to make, is that this figure and the variants that exist throughout Europe that emerge in these winter months, these beasts, serve some kind of ancient seasonal purpose, right? Seasonal ritual purpose. Which would be to, some people place it in this position where it's like chasing away winter, right? Like this idea of chasing away the negative spirits, or even just kind of the general liminality that comes along with like the dark times of year. To my mind, all this bell action, right? Like all this clattering that happens with Krampus and the different variants seems to lend credence to that theory, right? Because in terms of apopatreic like magic, the ringing of bells to dispel negativity is a pretty common thing, right? That you can track through time and through different regions. So yeah, you have that element of this pre-Christian kind of thing that was absorbed into a kind of folk Catholicism, right?
It's a way to like tend to human fragility.
Yeah, for sure. Like, and
Darkness, the cold.
the darkness, the cold, the
Lack of food.
right? I was just going to say threat of starvation. I
Yeah.
mean, there's just all kinds of things that represent danger when we get, and when we talk about like Krampus and his variants in Europe and all these midwinter beasts and kind of enacted rituals and stuff, it's a northern hemisphere thing, right? So it's across the board, and you could look kind of, you could pull this up into the British Isles as well and look at things as early as Samhain or Halloween time, right? Like when this kind of shift of the year occurs. It's the new year for, in the context of like Samhain and the Celts, it's like the new year, but what it really is it's the entrance into the dark times, right? And all of the harvest work is done, right? But that's what you have, right? And so you pull that through. And so there's a sense of feasting, but there's also a sense of danger and uncertainty, right? That gets embodied kind of from that time, we could say from the fall equinox, like through into like January 6th. So that would be Epiphany, right? So we're dealing with all of these seasonal like moments, right? That get folded into church and institutional kind of festivities and feast days and things like that.
Many layers.
Many layers, yeah. So yeah, I think that's certainly part of it, but I think that part of it too becomes about social control. And so when that script flips, or if these things are just kind of enmeshed anyway, right? Like as part of where we get this Krampus or Frau Perkta, who we can talk about if you're interested.
Yes.
But so this thing, right, of like right action, right? Like the right way to behave, and the threat then becoming socialized in a way, right? Like specific to the social sphere, where, it was more kind of ritualistic and maybe kind of based in like nature, right? Nature and culture relationships early on. But so, be good, do the right thing, or we're like, and this cannibalism thing, right? Like these midwinter spirits is like all, at least implicitly, like are like have a threat of cannibalism built in, right? Which is really interesting if you think about threats of like of starvation, or like kind of insecurities about being sustained, right, physically.
Just what I thought about.
Yeah, exactly. So so I think that runs through, and then we see it. I don't want to say necessarily kind of flattened as a symbol, but then it becomes about something else, right? Like about being naughty, or just in general not doing the right thing. So you have that going on, and And then you see it in the variants. And so we've talked about this embodied ritual action, but it also, Krampus and these other variants also kind of generate a kind of verbal, like lore, of verbal material, or kind of folk beliefs, right? That relate to these performances, but then become their own thing. So that's where kind of Frau Perkta comes in for me, is there's a lot of stories around this figure. Now, Krampus is the word that we know, okay? And it's the word that's used in parts of, in Alpen, Austria, but almost interchangeably is this word for winter spirit, the Perkten, right? So that's like plural for these spirits. And some Krampus troops refer to themselves as Perkten, right? They're Perkten troops. They're not, they don't kind of call themselves Krampus Troop X, right? They're Perkten Troop X. So this is a reference then to this figure Perkta, who is kind of differently represented, but again, you have this kind of convention of like a midwinter ogress almost, right? Like so. Or a hag, someone who lives in the wilderness, in the mountains, and embodies...
Witch.
Yes, the witch. And embodies this kind of, like liminality. And not just winter, but this idea of kind of uncertainty and ambivalence, really, right? Because she can be punishing, but she can reward as well.
Like
right?
Mother Nature.
Like Mother Nature, exactly. And so what's an interesting dichotomy is when you have Frau Perkta, just a disclaimer too, like pronunciation, Google it, I don't know.
Let's be honest, that's not my forte either.
Right, exactly. I mean, I can like read German like a champ, but my pronunciation is not great. And the reason I make that disclaimer is because I also want to reference Grilla from Iceland, who is a similar kind of like hag, like wilderness, kind of this troll figure that also has this ambivalence, right? A witch, right? She's essentially a witch. And I do want to talk about her later because I just started looking into a lot of this stuff and it's just so layered, like it just blows my mind. But I guess we can get to that. So Perkta, often referred to as the belly slitter, right? And So stories that surround Perkta often will involve, and it doesn't always have to be children, but again, this kind of gets flattened into a system that I think, particularly with Christmas, these things being Christmas adjacent, and that they're winter traditions. Often the stories about naughty children being punished rise to the surface, but it would happen as much to adults who didn't keep clean houses or finish certain important wintertime work before a certain date, or didn't eat enough on a feast day, or ate on a day they were supposed to be fasting, right? So there's all these things going on about food and work and sustaining, yourself kind of socially and economically, whatever that meant at the time. But she'll come in, right? You do this wrong thing, and she slits open your belly, pulls out all of your junk, right? Like all of your intestines
guts.
and your guts. And stuffs it with rocks or straw or whatever, right? So there's
friendly.
Yeah, she's nice. But the thing is, on the other end of the spectrum, like you can be rewarded if you've done the right thing by this same figure, right? There's a story like that involves Perkta, and then again we see this stuff get kind of folded into ecclesiastical belief and things like that. But there's a story about Perkta where she. First of all, in this conception, she leads a procession of children who died unbaptized, right? So they're spirits of damned children, essentially. And so a farmer or something is, he's has this cart and he's going down and the cart breaks, right? And he sees Perkta and he sees the children and he does, I would have to, you guys can look it up, but I would have to to do to get all the details, but essentially he does the right thing, right? And is rewarded for that right thing. His car is fixed, he has good, fortune in one way or another. So again, you have this ambivalence, right? It's like if you, and also if you really look at it, it's just, if you think about it, it's about respecting something that's bigger than you potentially, right? Because if you don't do the right thing and you get that punishment, it's just a flip side of the coin, right? Of it's about respect, right? Is looking at this thing that is like liminal, like, you know, ambivalent, different, fantastic, uncanny, right? And just respecting this thing that you don't understand.
Bigger than you.
That's bigger than you, right? Acknowledging this spirit that's bigger than you. So, yeah, I mean, and that's where a lot of this lore comes from. The Krampus situation with that kind of stuff is there's less lore generated around this figure because it has its roots so much in a kind of performance. I think the lore of Krampus being, you know, and what he might do to the children, right, I think comes from later interactions with like mass mediated material. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean contemporary stuff, right, or even institutional material.
So what's an example of that?
An example of that, well, so early on, really early on, an accompaniment to these Krampus celebrations and processions would be these plays, right, that would take place around the holidays. And if you look at, like, there's not a lot of kind of available like scripts of them, but I think there's like one particular one floating out there. But if you look at them, it's very, you can draw similarities to mumming plays, like kind of like in the UK, right?
I have no idea what you're talking
right.
about.
So it's a similar thing, except the mumming plays, like they travel. They'll go from, like, it's processional in a way too, and they'll go from like inn to inn or like house to house, and there's this kind of scripted, like it's the same figures that occur often. Cromwell got folded into them at some point, but the devil's there.
The devil's there.
The devil's there.
It's fine.
The devil's always there, which brings me to the point. So these plays, right, these that would happen in Austria, and again, this is an example of this stuff being folded in with the church, would include Saint Nicholas, right? And there would be this script, and it's essentially like people, like the figures will kind of tell you who they are and what they do. But in these plays, Krampus would often appear as well. And also, like, Krampus kind of embodying this idea of the Christian devil, right? Like, particularly that medieval kind of incarnation, right? So you see this all the time with these animalistic figures, right? That seem to come from performed traditions, getting folded into the therianthropic, which is just a fancy word for like animal man, right? Like these animal man hybrids being conflated with the devil, right? Because of the horns, the hoofs. So which came first? You know, who knows? But probably they were trying to kind of make these figures unpopular, right? Though they were so important to the people. So an easy way to do that was to associate them with evil, right? Like opposition to like the kindness, right? Like and which is how Christianity, Catholicism was often sold to people, because their kind of pagan worldviews accepted, like they're really earthy, right? And accepted that the world is a dangerous place. And coming in and offering this kind of this mitigate, like a way to mitigate the danger, right? This sense that everything's going to be okay. This guy will take care of you, right? Was a big force in kind of going and sowing the seeds of Catholicism around. But I feel like I've gotten off track. Yeah, so you have these things going on, but I do think that Krampus is like this association with the punishing behavior beyond the like, ooh, you know, I'll get you if you're not good next year, part of the performance comes later. The passion plays are one, right, where he starts to get associated with the devil. And that's actually like Teufel, I think is how I'll try and pronounce it, but this is another kind of interchangeable word for Krampus in Austria, which is essentially just German for devil.
But they use it in Austria.
They use it in Austria and Germany, but like again, this is something that a past might refer to themselves at a group. One of the troops might, you know, call themselves the, you know, whatever region Teufel, you know. So that relationship's certainly there. But then I think what happens, particularly if we go into kind of Edwardian times, then we have this burst of like mass media interaction with the Krampus figure in the form of these postcards, right? So these were invented in Austria, and at first they were really simple, but it caught on like crazy, right?
Like fire?
Like fire.
Because devil?
Well, first, I mean, the devil wasn't on the first ones, right? But the idea was like this was cheap. Like it was these were postcards, right? So you just paid for it, and the postage was on it, and it was super cheap. It was small. It was just a cheap and easy way to communicate with people. And they were just produced, you know, in the thousands and thousands, and people got really into them. And then they started to print illustrated ones, right, which were even more popular. And they, you know, kind of got more and more whimsical. And then chromolithography happened, right?
What's that?
Well, it's essentially just a printing, like it's a technological advance in printing that allowed them to create these very colorful, mass-produced, really, I guess is the important thing here, very colorful, kind of saturated, and, you know, complicated images, right? And so that started to happen, and so postcards, that's when you start to get what we think of postcards, right? Where you have this, like, you know, cool image on one side, you know, that says, you know, hey, this is what's happening, this is where I am, right? And there's this novelty factor to it, right? So they started making those to what was already a super popular way of communicating. I mean, this is an advancement in communication technology, essentially. And then, so the holiday ones became more and more popular because the level of whimsy that illustrators could achieve. Christmas cards started. Well, those were crazy popular, and then out of those came the Krampus cards, right? So Austria, I guess the association is there. Krampus is, you know, from that place, and this pushed like these images. First of all, kind of talking about the images, this is where a lot of us are kind of really familiar with this in the US, are really familiar with this depiction of Krampus, right? And this is the one that has that kind of like Victorian devil look, right? That borrows heavily from images of the medieval devil, but so you have Krampus here who has the, you know, like hooves, you know, the performed Krampuses don't have hooves or don't really have this association with being goat-footed, right? It's this amorphous kind of shaggy thing. I mean, if you saw a picture of like a Tyrolean, that's an area in Austria, Krampus like embodied next to one of these Krampus cards, you would be like, you know, there's a big leap here, right? The horns in common, maybe, but even these devil horns weren't really indicative of the shape and the forms of ibex horns, right? And the fact that they would use multiple ones. You have this real devilish figure, right? So then I think this is where the Christmas devil, you know, kind of moniker starts to emerge. So there's all these scenes of Krampus doing various things that Krampus does, and many of them are children chained up, or children, you know, in a sack crying, or
being tortured.
Yeah, being tortured. Yeah, literally. There's some that it's like he's like pulling their ears apart, and right. So then you get this really like vivid kind of, you know, I don't know, monstrous, violent indication, right, of this punishment, right? That the previous to that, I think, was really just in the tradition this threat, right? Like it was this conceptual kind of punishment. So, and then there's also ones where he like there's like ones that kind of frame Krampus as kind of like lascivious, right? So there's one like he's spying on like amorous couples like behind a rock, right? Or he has like you know Edwardian women in his basket on his back.
He's a player.
Right, he's a player. This doesn't relate to anything, but you could maybe Google it and find it. I've seen it in many places. But there's one where there's, in the foreground, there's a little blonde boy with his mouth like is bloody, like he has blood all over his mouth. And he's like offering like a long tongue. Okay, so this Krampus tongue to a kitten. And then the like background of this picture is like a Krampus, like, you know, far away, like in the background, like holding his mouth, like, so literally.
He bit the tongue off Krampus to give to a kitten?
That's what the image, yes, exactly. That's
What
the story
does that
that
mean?
I don't know. I don't know. Revenge? I don't know. It's like, or the idea that like this kid is so bad that like, you know, not even
Krampus could get this kid.
It's weird. Find it.
Cats associated with the devil in Mexican culture? They'll
It's
steal
very
the breath
possible.
from babies.
Yeah. Oh, well, the cats have like their own thing going on.
Cats are their own kind of evil.
Right. Well, and like also like this kind of sense of ambivalence,
That's
right?
true.
Like there's some kind of, and with Grilla from Iceland, there's a Yule cat, right? It's her pet cat. Yes.
Witches always have cats.
Yes, exactly. Well, and this one is what it does. So there's an Icelandic tradition where you gift like new winter clothes, like for Yule, essentially. It's part of the thing. So if you aren't engaging in this tradition, if you don't give your children like these new winter clothes, or if you're a bad kid and you won't wear your mittens or whatever, right? So the Yule cat is literally what it's called, stalks down from the mountains, and anybody not in their like new winter finest gets chomped, like it's just eaten alive, right? So
that's one way to make your kids with their winter clothes.
yeah, exactly, right? I mean, it's just so obvious. It's like make sure. First of all, it's social control in two ways.
Yeah.
It's like you spend that money on new winter clothes, right, and not on chocolate or liquor the party, right? Like for the parents, right? And then the other end of it is like, yeah, you're gonna wear your scarf, like whether you want to or not, right? So that's part of the whole Grella thing. There's more going on. The Yule lads are her sons too, and they're super weird. But she knows when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake. So it's like all year she's in her mountain. We're getting off track again.
That's so cool.
I know, this one's great. All year she's in her kind of mountain cave home, right?
It's frozen.
Yeah, maybe it's like frozen, like in the like post-apocalyptic future. It's where Elsa, is that her name? It's where she ends up, right? I don't know, not really. But so anyway, she
forever alone and angry with her cat.
right, and kind of like old and grizzled and preparing like the recipe for children that she's gonna eat. So
I feel like that was just a crossover of Frozen and the Sanderson sisters.
oh yeah, Hocus Pocus.
Hocus Pocus, yeah.
The thing is,
it's like
it's like
Frozen meets Hocus Pocus.
right. Well, give that time. I don't know. They're both Disney properties, so who knows what they'll do.
2032.
Yeah. Frozen, Hocus Pocus. But the thing is like America's starting to get it, like is starting to look at these dark stories that are Christmas adjacent. And Christmas adjacent, why? Because it's winter time, right? Like it's midwinter time. This is all around the winter solstice, and we're at this point in the northern hemisphere. Days have gotten shorter, right? And that's the whole point of the winter solstice, is it's the longest night of the year.
You're telling me it's 5 o'clock.
I know.
Pitch black outside.
Well, I was driving back from Medford, and it was 4:30 and dark, and I was like, "Is it 9 o'clock at night?" Like it's hard to get used to,
the
right?
Pacific Northwest.
Yes, it sure is. But it stays light out until 10 p.m. in the
summer.
summertime. So,
Days never end.
anyway.
Off track again.
Yes, but this is the thing. So, like in reference, we're gonna seriously this idea of like Frozen Hocus Pocus. I'm gonna engage with this a little bit because increasingly it seems to me in my research that there's a sense that in the United States people want to return to some kind of acknowledgement of the dark side of we'll say Christmas, if that's what if that's what you're celebrating. It seems to be a response to something. To my mind, that's activated by some need, right? There's a certain kind of usefulness, be it psychological, kind of in tandem with biological, right? To put a face, a story, a body, right, on this time of year, and to engage in this kind of, almost ghost story activity. And I do think that we're seeing that more and more. So maybe we will, maybe Disney will be like, all of this stuff will continue to emerge in U.S. culture, and then it'll be, massified in that way, where we will have a Pixar movie that's all about, the adventures of Grilla and the Yule Lads, right? And
if you're listening, Disney, the check can be written directly to Nikki. Cox. Thank you.
Intellectual property.
Thank you.
We're just going to check that box right now.
10% to Kirk.
Yeah, I'll take my cut. But yeah, I do think that there's something about that. And then, of course, just again, we look at these things, just kind of a note on tradition, right? Like tradition is something that we kind of offhandedly define, like it has a connotation as being something that's unchanging and static, right? And that's how tradition works, is that it's something that, is almost a survival, and it's just like was this way and just continued this way. And that's why it's traditional.
And it'll always be that way.
And it'll always be that way. And the truth of it is that traditions are always in a process of changing, because that's how traditions actually do survive. When they cease to be able to be turned toward like important cultural use or social use, that's when they stop being observed, right? Like they literally die out. So the idea of dynamic tradition is an idea that's really important to me. And this idea of like kind of looking at holidays and traditions, and some people thinking that this is some kind of like trivial space to investigate. The reality is that it's super important in kind of identifying kind of culturally where we're at, right? And I say where we're at, but like where any kind of, social group or cultural group is at. You look at these traditions, celebrations, these enactments, beliefs that accumulate around times of year or certain celebrations, and it can kind of tell you a lot about what is considered most at stake, right? So that's why I'm interested in this stuff particularly. But I do think that, there's something to this movement back toward the dark, the dark Christmas, or the these beliefs and traditions that embody that relationship, in response to this idea of like the U.S. Christmas, right? Where it's like, Elf on the Shelf. Well, and just like, not only do you have this kind of, I think that something feels disingenuous, to me anyway, and then to some of the people that I've talked to in my research, something feels disingenuous about this sanitizing, this like the U.S. winter holiday landscape is so sanitized, and so then we're not accessing the same thing anymore in terms of what's really going on. Why do we put the lights up? Like, that's light in the darkness, right? So the darkness has to be there. And when we look at, dare I say, a late capitalist, holiday system, everything is just being so flattened because something else is being foregrounded, right? And that thing that's being foregrounded maybe isn't particularly useful to how we operate in the world.
I have an idea.
What's that?
Tell me if it's crazy.
Okay.
Could it possibly be partially because we've found levels of comfort that fare off our concern about starvation and cold, and we are more concerned about this pursuit of happiness, and we understand capital gains, meaning presents and buying things, as a means of bringing happiness, and that's what we are now in the pursuit of? Right.
And there's something then, but again, that's a product of a capitalist system, like a dominant kind of capitalist culture, is this idea of now the idea of subsistence, the idea of like staying alive is now being associated with like, what can I have to make me happy? What can I get to make me happy? How can I how am I good enough? Like, we're bombarded with messages, like just in our society, we're bombarded with messages. The kind of baseline message is always, you're not doing enough, you're not doing it right, and you're maybe not, good enough. Right? That's how things are sold to us. That's how we're kept like moving. That's how we motivate ourselves in a lot of ways. So I do think there's something to that, right? Like we don't need to survive the winter, you know, in terms of like physical sustenance, but often we have to survive the winter in terms of I don't know, emotional like health, right?
Yeah.
And so but I do think that that's also part of the response. I think that's also what's bringing Krampus and related figures into the US holiday landscape, right? Like I think that it's different here, right? Like Krampus is so clearly an oppositional figure when we look at the US Krampus.
The old Saint Nick.
Right, exactly. Versus Krampus. And you literally you have memes and you know, US mass media, like cartoons, movies, whatever, that literally put them like, you know, there's movie posters, there's memes, there's illustrations that literally have them like squaring off against each other, right? And then Krampus starts to represent this kind of anti-hero, right? That's pushing against this sanitized gift giving, right? Like this idea of like, you know, and getting gifts for everything, right? Like it's so important to kind of our economic calendar in the United States that this whole idea that like bad kids and bad people don't get presents is like that has been backgrounded to the point where it's almost invisible. I mean, you don't even see, like in mass media, you rarely even see references to the coal in the stocking anymore, right?
Right, or it's a joke, and you still get presents.
Exactly. I mean, certainly it gets referenced in this mass media material, but it's definitely backgrounded because you want to make sure that people go out and buy presents for everyone, right? And that's what a good Christmas represents, right? It is, it's a terrible Christmas if there's no presents under the tree, right?
It's like the first episode of The Simpsons.
Yeah.
Homer loses his job and he can't buy presents and he thinks it's the worst Christmas ever, and then he brings home a dog and they're all so happy. Yeah,
and so I do think that Krampus coming and being embraced really, particularly in the last few years, and particularly like maybe not particularly, but partly at least in these grassroots like events that occur like in cities all over the place at this point.
How did Krampus even get here?
So Krampus got to the U.S. through digital portals.
What?
Yeah, crazy, right? And pretty late. So kind of a caveat to that. So essentially, a lot of what we do as people in the U.S. who celebrate Christmas, a lot of these, like the Christmas tree, like a lot of our traditions are pretty young, right? Like they come from I don't know, the 1800s, really, the Christmas tree, all this stuff. But a lot of them also come from Austria and Germany, right? A lot of these things got to us back then through those places, but not Krampus, right? So he didn't come back then. And even when we had the Krampus cards kind of getting super popular all over Europe, they never really made their way to the United States, okay? So with the exception of some early things like Belschnickel, like so German immigrants would Belschnickel, which is this kind of variation, I guess, on the Krampus figure, much more human, but maybe more in keeping with this image of the basket carrier, right, which is this kind of like dirty kind of wild guy, and often sometimes a cross-dressing element too. But this like in Appalachia, so German immigrants would kind of do this in Appalachia. And then that kind of died out. So that was like the closest thing really that we got until actually the early 2000s, right? So you have this like this.
So less than 20 years.
Oh yeah. So and as all of this stuff was being kind of imported into the U.S. Christmas holiday landscape from these areas, from Europe, right, and from particularly from Austria, Germany, you know. There's this omission, right, of Krampus. We got St. Nicholas, right, and then Clement Moore turned him into Santa Claus, and then Coca-Cola kind of like polished him up, and so we have our Santa.
It's everyone's grandpa.
Everyone's grandpa, and secularized too. I mean, available to everybody, right? We still call him Saint Nick from time to time, but it's a nickname. I mean, his name is Santa Claus.
Santa Claus.
Santa Claus. Yeah. So then you have all this time, no Krampus, and then in the 2000s, with kind of digital access, like allowing us to look at things from all over the world, scans of those cards, those Edwardian cards, started to show up on, early social media, or just kind of generally just show up on websites and be shared. And like-minded people were like looking at this, and it's like, so here's Saint Nicholas and a Christmas tree, and then this devil that like has kids in chains, and it's like people are like, I think that there's this sense of like, wait, what's going on, and why didn't we know about this, right? So you have certain groups of people that get really kind of energized by this unpredictable holiday material that they didn't have access to, and then also at the same time on like tourism websites. And places like that, you had images of the European like urban processions, right? And those are a little different from the stuff that we talked about at the top of the podcast, where it was the processions and the kind of like village traditional expressions. These European urban parades, I mean, they're processions, but they're very paradey. It's a lot different, right? Like many of them have the like the crowd is separated, and they're very large, and then there's this bend towards like a horror Krampus in those, right, where you get kind of more of a latex mask vibe. The traditional ones like are there too, like the groups and troops from the passes will come to them as well. And then there's fire play. It's a lot more. There's like more of a sense of like violence almost, like you're gonna get hit, but it's usually between like people who are Krampusing. I guess we'll use it as a verb because that happens in America now all the time, in particular groups that will go after adults that are like on the spectators with their switches and whips and stuff, and they kind of like stand against each other. So anyway, these things were becoming they were kind of getting out there in like English language websites and things, and there's a whole groups of people who were really energized, like I said, by this material that just seems so alien, right? Like, what is this figure doing in this space, right? There doesn't seem to be any room for that in our version, in the U.S. version of Christmas, right? To drop this monster, literally into the mix. So people just started sharing this stuff and doing their research and seeing what was going on. And there, like I think that early on it was just this like miasma of images being shared, right? And people were into it but didn't really know what to do with it. And I think that as time went on and more of this material became available, people started to understand what was happening in terms of the enactments, right? And wanted to do something like that. And so then you have this happening, and then in 2011, I want to say, or was it earlier? Because this was the 9th one. Maybe it was, yeah, I don't know. So around that time, Portland, Oregon, had their first Krampuslauf, and the organizers didn't know about it, but also an organizer in Columbia, South Carolina, had staged the first one there that same year.
Literally across the country.
Across the country, literally, and they did at the time they weren't aware. Now I think as they were in these planning modes, they became aware, right, of one another before the nights of the actual like respective laufs. And then after that, I think Philadelphia was the next year.
Literally still across the
country. Literally still across the country. But the organizer of Philadelphia had been in contact because she saw the stuff that the organizer of Portland was putting up, and was like, hey, wait, what is this, right? And so then it snowballed from there, and so the latest kind of official count that I got was over 30 cities in the United States have some kind of Krampus based event, be it like Laufs, and that's German for run, right? So these are like procession based, where people put on the regalia, right? They solve and in creative ways, right? They solve the problem of embodying this figure, this Krampus. And often there'll be this DIY vibe, or at least pulling like from what they can get, to create this monster, right? Like this Christmas demon, and embody it and go out in the street and superimpose themselves on public spaces, you know, around the time that Christmas shopping is just like, you know, popping up, and they happen in urban areas, or at least downtown areas, right? Not kind of in the suburbs or whatever.
Right.
So there's something going on there that feels oppositional in a way. I mean, of course, it's like many people do it because it's fun, right? Because that's how things work. I mean, that's the baseline. But there's some other kind of thing that's going on that feels more kind of important into why these things are increasingly popping up. I mean, like DC has one. Baltimore has one. New Orleans has one. The crew of Krampus, right? So it's very informed by, you know, by the culture of the cities, which is often the case, right? Like they start to take on their own kind of character that speaks to the communities in which they're occurring. And it's just amazing to me that in a relatively short period of time, you have this traditional material emerge into the U.S. system and get shifted in a way, right? So there's this new dynamic happening, again, where we think of tradition as being like static. It's very plastic in this sense. And so it's interesting to me, like, why that's happening. And kind of what it represents, which I kind of spoke to a bit earlier. But I do think there's also a sense of like, again, it's for fun, but I do think there's a sense of having some kind of ritual opportunity as well, right? Being able to put on a mask, right, and kind of like cavort through the streets covered in bells. I can say from personal experience, it does something, right? Like it's something it pulls you out of kind of this flattened, like, you know, experience of what the holidays start to feel like, right? And the expectations and things like that. And its relationship with this kind of winter enactment going back, you know, gives you a sense of, you know, being part of something bigger than yourself, which is interesting. And I think part of the motivating factor, particularly for how it spreads in these groups that actually put on these events. And again, the digital Krampus is very much present in how these things play out too, because particularly mostly on Facebook, right? Because Facebook is for organization at this point, right? Like that's what differentiates it from other social media platforms, right? Even though it's not necessarily the one that like we all want to interact with at this point.
We're all on it for events. Let's be
events,
honest.
yeah, totally. And so because it serves that organization, you can have pages, groups, right? And it's all free. You can put out, you know, information. You can share costume making techniques. You can share memes that like have to do with Krampus, right? So first you have these organizational pages that are about organizing the local events, right? And you know, it's how people decide what day they're going to have them, right? It's always close to December 5th, which is Krampusnacht, but the weekends are when most people are going to be able to participate. So you have that kind of, you know, going on and figuring out where, right? Like putting out the routes. Where are we going to walk? Where are we going to run? So all that is happening. But what's interesting is you can have a group. You have all these groups all over the country, and you have a group where if you go to the event, like maybe 50 people are actually at that particular local event, and you know, dressed as Krampus or one of these other spirits, and kind of ready to run. But they're the people who have liked their page or who are part of their group can be in the hundreds, right? Like and just kind of peak. And the idea is that so then all of these different groups, you know, are the members and organizers are looking at one another's pages and interacting with one another's groups with material, like I said, be it like costume, you know, tips, sharing more of those videos, right? Saying, like, what I was kind of pointing out as part of what I've discovered is these localized groups, like, happening on the ground, and then the emergence of this delocalized, like, Krampus culture of these people who are part of these localized communities interacting with each other, kind of like across the country and internationally too. The first UK run happened this year in Whitby.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is interesting because you would think that Krampus might go from Austria to the UK a little easier.
Yeah.
But what we've seen is this, like, you know, Krampus coming through digital portals in the 2000s and getting embraced in the US has generated all of this material, and that's kind of like part of how the Whitby run was conceptualized and organized, right? Is part of the information that was coming from it happening here, right? And that's fascinating to me because the UK has a seasonal calendar that is just chock full of processions and those kind of enactments, right?
Interesting.
And this is the first major one, and it has, I dare say, a kind of a U.S. character in that it involves, you can find videos of it easily, and it was beautiful, but it involves so many different, like, access to so many different of these winter spirits, right? Like, it's, and I think that that's something that's very particularly U.S. expressions, is that it invites you to embody this ambivalent dark winter in whatever way feels like, you know, important and accessible to you, right? So you don't have to show up as any one kind of Krampus or a Krampus at all. You can show up as Perkta, you can show up as Grilla. I mean, you know what I mean? So
I want to be the witch.
yeah, totally. Why not? And there's all these variants. You could be a Schnabel Perkton. Yeah, so there's all kinds of stuff going on with that, with those performed kind of things and how they're being constructed and construed and enacted in the United States, which to me is pretty fascinating. So I think that covers it. I mean, I do think, first of all, I think that next year we should do like a whole podcast just on the variations.
Yes.
Because that's like, now I'm starting to like really dig into that stuff, and it's so good. But, oh yeah, before we go, Grilla, so we talked about her cat, the Yule cat, right? And she's in her mountain, and all year long she knows if kids have been bad or good, right? So be good for goodness sake, because if you're not, she'll come down the mountain around Yule, and her and her husband will put you in a bag, take you up, and she'll literally cook you and eat you.
Literally frozen hocus pocus.
Yes, frozen hocus pocus. But she has like lots of, like, as is kind of, I think, common with kind of this ogress kind of troll like lore. She has all of these kids, right? It feels very kind of Norse mythology, right? So kind of monstrous children from her ogre husband and other fathers. But 12 of them are the Yule lads. And they come down at Yule, and now they're kind of just mischievous, and they do all this stuff. And
Are they gremlins?
They're okay. So they're more. They're originally, well, early anyway. They were described as half monsters with no torsos. So what does
that mean?
I was just about to say what that looks like. I'm not sure. Fan art that.
Do they just have like butts?
Maybe.
Do they have heads
maybe
connected
like I.
with butts with arms and legs?
Yes, I think that about describes it. Like big heads with, like, I don't know, arms coming out like under their ears or something. Anyway.
What is that? Please draw us this, fans.
Yeah, post that. And choose one, because there's 12 of them, but some of the names, they're named after the kind of mysterious stuff they show up and do.
Okay.
So there's Spoon Licker, which is like my favorite, because he comes into your house, like he breaks in your house and secretly like licks your spoons, which is awesome.
How rude.
I know. And then you don't know, so it's, like, it's that thing where it's like, ooh, a spoon tastes weird. Is that a thing? Maybe. Now I feel like I admitted that's a thing in my house. But maybe it's Spoon Licker. Doorway Sniffer is another one. So I'm not, like, when I first read this name, I'm like, so what mischievous what's mischievous about sniffing the doorway? But then I remember as a kid, like if you have a dog, if you grew up with a dog or something, like as a kid and you're kind of half asleep and maybe the dog's like walking through the hallway and does the like sniff around the door, there's something that feels kind of eerie about that. But that's just me like positioning what doorway sniffer does.
I thought you were gonna say like kids with sticky hands touching doorways.
Well, that could be it too. It's like,
your house is dirty.
yeah, that easily could be part of it. If anybody knows more why you like the doorway, what the doorway sniffer is about, let us know. Door slammer, no big deal. Meat hook is one, but I think he just steals meat. And that goes along with, I mean, it sounds like, you know, an urban legend, right?
Yeah.
So I imagine this torso-less, like, head with a butt. And it's like,
stealing
well, even
meat
just coming in with a meat hook.
to make
like,
himself a torso.
right. Sausage swiper, which is, you know, it's similar. And then window peeper.
He peeps in your windows.
Peeps in your windows. So those are just a few. There's other ones. But yeah, so there's 12 of them, and they come down and they're Gorilla's sons, and they were originally torso-less monsters, however that works. But they've morphed over time, right? So again, we see this kind of transition, this dynamic kind of traditional transformation that happens to make them survive. It's like they're evolving in a way. And now they're more gnomish, right? So like there's the Tomta or the Nisa, which are like Scandinavian. They're associated with Yule, but they're very much how we would, like they have that garden gnomey look almost. Like that's how it's easy to explain to audiences in the U.S. And now they interact. So people now will dress up like in Iceland. You'll have men who dress up like them. In kind of comical ways and interact with children in very similar ways to the way that maybe a mall Santa would, right? Like I think it's much more kind of playful and performative, but you have these kind of, and they still have that mischievous element, right? But the comedy like has been, you know, foregrounded and they're, you know, they've gone from being ambivalent liminal figures to still I think liminal figures, but it's more about whimsy, right? But their mom is still potentially gonna eat you if you, yeah, exactly. The mom is still hocus pocus frozen. So yeah, that's to me that's very interesting, and it's an example of how these things kind of morph over time, and do different things and survive, right? I mean, so Gorilla still gets to be like, you know, cannibal. But her sons like play the good guys in it, or you know, the fun folk.
Cool guys.
Yeah, and the Yule Cats still eat you if you don't wear your mittens. So that stuff's still in play.
So wear your mittens.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's it. I also think that we could probably do like another hour on. I could just keep going, but I'm not gonna. We could keep like on looking at how these things start to pop up. I mean, I kind of talked about it briefly, but like how they start to pop up in mass media, in U.S. mass media, and how that it seems to be ramping up, right? Like, and there's the movie, the Krampus movie, that got the widest distribution. I mean, there's other kind of like horror Christmas movies that feature Krampus, but that Krampus movie came out, I think 2013, maybe not, but around then. And you would think that would have somehow been a peak, but I think that what's happening is that you're seeing more representations, particularly in television. So the presence seems to amp. Like there seems to be more of a place for Krampus and these other winter spirits. I mean, Sabrina, the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the new Netflix show, they've put out a holiday special, right? I haven't watched it yet, but it's interesting to me because they're literally they construe witchcraft, like the witches in that show as Satanists, right? And they're not necessarily, you know, shown as evil, terrible Satanists, right? Like it's a different thing, but they put out a Christmas special, right? And it's a Yule, you know, it's very Yule forward, but, and again, I've yet to watch it because I'm kind of saving it, but
You're saving it?
yeah, for something like
for
closer to
a rainy
Christmas.
day?
Yeah, closer to Christmas.
Oh, okay.
So you drink cocoa, eat a gingerbread man, watch Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, Yule
Another
special.
day in Kirk's life.
Right. But Gorilla's represented in that. in a different way, right? But so you have these European like winter spirits, representative of the dark side, the darker, pieces of this season, continuing to emerge in popular culture. I think it was last year, Conan O'Brien had a cooking segment with Krampus, right? Some guy being...
Cooking with Krampus.
That's exactly what it was called, I think. And so there's all kinds of, like, it just keeps kind of folding in and popping up. And then, and then we see how it interacts with these ideas of the war on Christmas and all that kind of stuff. And
red Starbucks cups.
Red Starbucks cups, right.
I want a Krampus Starbucks
I was just
cup.
about to say, when they put Krampus on the Starbucks cup, we'll know that the battle lines have been drawn. But yeah, there's a museum, I think, in New England that had a Krampus tree, right? They put up a Krampus tree, and it would, Krampus ornaments, and it wasn't particularly traditional, right? But it was a Krampus tree, whatever.
Whatever.
And people in the community who identify as devout Christians, like, kind of were so vocal in their opposition that the museum took down the tree, right? So we see a different kind of, like, if we're going to refer to this American version as kind of subcultural in a way, it like interferes with this idea that these subcultures like just get incorporated, right? And then lose their like subcultural kind of vibe.
Right.
I mean, I think that what we're seeing is a kind of transmission through pop culture consumption, where these representations may not be quote unquote traditional, but yet the figure is still then being brought to the fore, like progressively through time. And so the incorporation is almost coming at the same time as the subcultural action, and then so the moral panic may or may not emerge from like either so grassroots enactments or mass culture representations, or something both is going on, right? So, which I think makes sense if you think about Christmas in late capitalism, right, in the United States.
It's gonna be the title of this podcast. Christmas in late capitalism.
Yeah, I don't want to harp too much on that point of view, but I do, like, from my research, there is some kind of thing going on that's a response to, not just that, but also this idea of like, voices saying, let's be jolly, right? Maybe I don't feel like being jolly,
I do love the Grinch.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's the Grinch is, there's an association, I think,
with Santa.
It's impossible to...
He's Krampus, and then his heart grows, and now
right.
he's Santa Claus.
Oh, yeah. He's like a Krampus that is cured or something.
He's a troll. He's a troll, and his mom is up in the cabin.
We have to, yeah.
Max is the antithesis of the cat. Max is the pure good dog.
This is good stuff, Nikki. This is good stuff. I think that we have to write we'll write Grinch fan fiction that references like all of these.
And that is how Disney will find Hocus Pocus Frozen.
Right.
And it'll happen in 2038.
Yes, I'm writing this down in case it comes true. Okay. And then I'll just, wherever I am, I'll message you, and I'll be like, you called it. How'd you know? Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. But yeah, it's been fun. Keep an eye out, because you'll see this stuff, not just Krampus, but all the
cool stuff.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's out there.
Thank you, Kirk.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Kirk, and thank you for listening. We appreciate each of you and love hearing from you. So hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or email us at talesofthe2citiespodcast@gmail.com. Please rate, review, and subscribe on the listening platform of your choice. We're on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, YouTube, and finally, Spotify. We're a bi-weekly podcast, but if you just can't wait for the next episode, head over to Patreon and pledge for mini episodes and bonus content. And it is the season for giving, despite the fact that Krampus hates that. So head over to TeePublic and check out some of the badass sales that we have on our merch. And again, we appreciate each of you. Thanks for listening. Until next time.